Hello, and thank you for joining the Builders FirstSource and Zonda Q3 Market Intelligence webinar. We've got a lot of information to share with you guys today and really are working to try and keep everybody up to date on what we know as real-time data and just share as much as possible here to make sure everybody can figure out what our economy and what our housing industry is going to look like over the next 6 to 12 months. So everybody is in listen only mode, but if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat. And we will do our best to answer all of those questions you have throughout the call. With that, I'd like to introduce our EVP of Digital Solutions, Tim Page. Tim?
All right, very good. Thank you, Mike, and thank you for everybody for attending today's call. Earlier this year, many of you know we launched our Builders FirstSource digital tools, which will create value for our home builder customers. We believe these tools will provide greater transparency and control over your projects, help you accelerate the sales process, better engage home buyers, and streamline construction. One of these new digital tools is Home Configure, which allows real-time interior and exterior selections to be viewed in a photorealistic 3D model. We're going to play a short video produced by the Build Show that explains the benefits of our Home Configure technology.
You know, one of the worst things that can happen to you as a builder is to come to a client meeting with your house under construction and your client is disappointed. What they're seeing on site is not what they visualized in their mind it was going to look like, and they're disappointed. They're wishing they would have done something different. Maybe you even get a change order to rip something out and do it differently. Well, Builders FirstSource has a solution for you called Home Configure. My name is Matt Reisinger. I'm a builder down here in Austin, Texas, but you probably know me from the Build Show. Now, Home Configure is brand new from Builders FirstSource, available at mybuilder.com. And what they're going to do is they're going to upload your 2D plans, and they're going to give you a 3D visualization. So for instance, the exterior in my house, I finished this about a year ago. They've rendered it in this service, and now you can walk around the entire house and see what it looks like on the computer before it's built. But beyond that, it's not just a rendering. That's why they don't call it home rendering service. I had a rendering done on this house, and the architect totally got wrong what I kind of told him to make it like. My wife had no idea what we were getting. She trusted me, but when she saw this house under construction, literally everything was a surprise to her because this is not her skill set, is visualizing what things are going to look like. Now this, on the other hand, from Builders FirstSource, Home Configure, you can press buttons and totally change the look of the house right there in the computer. And your clients can do this in their living room on their own time. It doesn't have to just be in that short meeting time with you. They can change the color of the house. They can change the roof. They can change the brick. All these things with just a click of the button. $4.99 for an exterior home visualization. But even more powerful, you can go inside the house and render the inside as well. Now check out my interior, for instance. They're going to spotlight a few areas of your house, your kitchen, your master bath, your living room. And isn't this crazy how realistic this is? And again, with a click of a button, they can totally change all the selections. They can show clients what a walnut kitchen would look like, or gray cabinets, or whatever, different floor colors, different fixtures even. I think this is going to save you a lot of heartache as a builder and is really going to make your clients have a totally different experience. The other thing I really like about this is I think that selections and that process can be very difficult for clients. They're worried about how does everything work together. It's really hard for them just to go to a tile store or pick paint colors, but to be able to see this in a 3D photorealistic type setting, this is really going to give them assurances that the build is going to be what they're expecting. If you're an existing Builders FirstSource customer, all you need to do is go to mybldr.com and upload your 2Ds and order this rendering right from the website. If you aren't an existing BFS customer and don't have a MyBLDR account, visit the digital tools section of Builders FirstSource website, bldr.com, to learn more and connect with one of our experts. In summary, there's some really cool stuff happening from the Paradigm acquisition that BFS made a couple years ago, and this is one of them. Stay tuned for more.
Okay, very good. So we will soon be linking this Home Configure technology to a curated builder catalog experience and also the material takeoff. So much more exciting stuff to come. Home Configure and our other digital tools will help you improve and differentiate your business in these uncertain economic times. So as Matt said in the video, please log into mybldr.com or contact your BFS sales representative for more information. Thank you for the time. I'm going to now turn it over to Steve LaValley, our Vice President of Forest Products and Transportation, and he'll provide a quick update on commodities.
Great, and thank you, Tim. That's really awesome stuff on the paradigm side of the table. So I'll take a couple minutes here to touch on commodities. Just looking at near-term trends in commodity prices, it's always interesting kind of pull back and look at, from the perspective of a longer-term perspective. So we look at the chart on the screen here, looking at the last 3 years. This year's commodity market, as kind of judged by the Random Lengths framing lumber composite, looks relatively mundane, relatively flat. But when we look at it the 10 years prior to that, this year's market is actually fairly volatile, very similar to the prior years before that. The biggest difference is the baseline's increased. When we look at the 10-year average before the COVID years, at 354 versus the framing lumber composite average this year, it goes from 354 up to 418. We don't know if this year's prices are going to stick, be higher, be lower, but it's interesting to point out that's almost a 20% increase in the baseline. Similar to lumber, OSB market this year looks relatively flat, but by historical norms, it's actually been pretty volatile. This is all these other lines on here are the 10 years prior to the COVID years. This year's volatility is actually one of the most volatile, taking out the last 3 years. An interesting thing there, the average is also about the same. It's about 20% greater, the average of the composite this year relative to the 10 years pre-COVID. What is my point in all that? I tend to think the inflation we've seen over the last few years is sticky. And maybe we won't have the year-over-year increases every single year that we saw in the tremendous volatility, but I think the baseline cost has gone up, and to expect higher highs and higher lows as time goes on. Certainly a big piece of what the volatility picture may be is demand. So we tend to think that if we have a starts scenario that's in the 1.3 to 1.4 million starts, maybe as high as 1.5 for short periods of time, that there's adequate supply in the industry on lumber and sheet goods, commodity OSB and plywood, to satisfy the demand. There's additional capacity in southern yellow pine. It's been largely offset by decreases in production in Western Canada. There's additional OSB capacity planned to come online later this year and early 2024. We start to see starts trend above 1.5 to 1.6 or higher for several months at a time. We're very likely again to start to see some of these stresses in the supply chain. So it's kind of a little bit of a swim lane. For 1.3 to 1.4, market probably doesn't look a lot different than this year. We start to go above 1.5, you're going to get into more volatile times again. So what is BFS looking to do about it? Well, BFS supply chain is actively working to take costs out of the channel by partnering with our suppliers and customers and building greater efficiencies. You saw some of the stuff that Tim was going through with the paradigm and the design software there. A lot of our supply chain activities are around taking cost out of the channel together with our suppliers. So BFS has built a tremendous platform to serve the industry, and I think together we can leverage our scale to build better solutions. On that, I'll turn it over to Jeff Rettig.
Thank you, Steve. Hey, we're getting a lot of questions out there about the strength of the capacity in the supply chain across the industry with the uptick in construction we've seen this year. The good news is quite a few of the major building product manufacturers invested heavily over the last couple of years. They built new plants, they acquired additional production, they added additional production lines, and installed automation to help increase capacity. This has helped position them for additional growth in housing. BFS alone has invested millions in truss capacity and door production so that we can meet our builders' demand going forward. The one area where the industry continues to struggle, though, is finding additional labor to run that additional capacity. Automation, as I mentioned before, will help offset some of that labor needed, but labor will continue to be a factor going forward. As we look forward to 24, we are starting to see some manufacturers signal some sort of price increase announcements for Q4 or Q1. And if we think about what's driving that, it is the increased competition for labor that's driving up wages, rising energy costs, and transportation costs that have bottomed out and are starting to increase back up again. As Steve mentioned, we're asking for your partnership in planning. By working together, we can work with the manufacturers to have the product when and where you need it. This helps manufacturers ensure that they're running efficiently and helping pass along that efficiency to us and our customers. As you are looking forward and planning for 24, please ensure that you're having the planning discussions with your local BFS sales representative so that we can ensure we have the product you need at the best price. Now I'll turn it over to Allie Wolf, Chief Economist for Zonda. Allie?
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here partnering with BFS to go through the state of the housing market. Now for today's presentation, I have about 40 minutes. We'll go through the agenda in just a moment. But in case you're not familiar, hi everyone, I'm Allie Wolf. I'm the Chief Economist with Zonda. If you're not overly familiar with Zonda, we are a housing data and consultancy firm. We track the entire building life cycle from raw land all the way up to the closing out of new home communities. When we're looking at the market, we're trying to make sense of what's happening in the economy, what's happening with policy, how is the new home market interacting with the existing home market, and what are we seeing in terms of sales trends and starts trends across the country. In today's presentation, I'll cover many of those topics. Like I said, 40 minutes, 5 sections. We'll start with housing trends, really what have we seen so far over the past few months with home sales. We'll talk about a main issue in the market, which is prices and affordability, but also solutions and workarounds to those challenges. We'll discuss buyers. Who's out there today? How are people still buying homes despite some of the challenges with affordability? We'll go to the core of the housing market, talking about land and lots, and then we'll finish with our final thoughts. So as we dive into housing trends, I want to just address it head on. What we're dealing with right now is interest rates that are in the 7%. This is after pretty consistently being in the 6%. We asked for some questions ahead of time, and I know one of the questions is about mortgage rates. So when we get to the end and we go through Q&A, we can talk about why interest rates are rising and what could make them come back down. But we have to acknowledge that our reality is we've seen a 50 to 70% change in the monthly payment just compared to the beginning of last year. This is a very clear and very dramatic affordability shock. And as you see numbers like this, you've got to imagine that sales are going to be impacted, and they are. If you look at existing home sales, they're down. This is the new data from this morning, down 16% compared to last year, down 2% month over month. If you break it out by market, what you're finding is almost everywhere across the country has sales both down year over year and down compared to 2019. Now, again, this is existing home sales. And when you see numbers like this, you really have to ask yourself why. So yes, part of it is because interest rates have gone up so much so quickly. Part of it has to do with confidence in the housing market, in the economy, albeit we're seeing confidence improve actually compared to where we were over the past few months. A lot of the story behind the contraction in overall sales comes down to inventory. When you look at active listings, both nationally and locally, many of you have been with us as we track this every single month. And if you look at the chart on the left for 2023, the July data, we're now below where we were in 2022. This is following basically the whole year, us outperforming the past couple of years. That's really not even the big picture. The big picture is how dramatically we are both nationally and in top markets down compared to 2019. 2019 is our healthy year for comparison. And even back then when we were doing presentations, we were talking about how limited overall inventory is. I think we all understand why. That clear disincentive to stay put, or that clear disincentive to sell. You have this incentive to stay put because of the current mortgage rate that people have locked in. 80% of people have a rate under 5%. When you're dealing with 7%, there's got to be a really good reason why someone would want to sell and reset that interest rate. More people are choosing to stay put, choosing to remodel, choosing to turn their home into a rental. But as we go later into this section, we'll highlight that there are some reasons why people would get rid of their mortgage rate, why people would contribute to the market today. We'll get to that a little bit later. But what we know is it's not that no one is buying homes. It's not that there aren't transactions. In fact, when you look at the combined new and existing home sales, we're hitting almost 5 million this year. But there is a very clear divergence between what's happening on the resale side and what's happening in the new home side. So when we got the new existing home data this morning, it was at the lowest level it had been in 6 months. When you look at new home data, we released our data from Zonda yesterday for new home sales. We're well above where we were in 2019, and we're not following this downward trend. In fact, we've gained steam and we've gained sales as we've gone throughout this year. Now, as you look at something like this and you think about how we've talked about, okay, an affordability shock and interest rates going up, this seems pretty counterintuitive. You would imagine when you go from at the base 2.5% interest rates to 7%, sales would come down. And they absolutely did. That's what we saw last year. That is what the Federal Reserve had expected to happen. When they raise interest rates, they're going to impact interest rate sensitive industries more so than others, ours taking the brunt of the impact. We saw that third and fourth quarter of last year. But then there was this unintended consequence, which is, yeah, demand came down, but supply came down even more. And what that's done is offer this opportunity to anyone or any organization that has inventory right now. So if you look at what's happening on the existing home side, we're still finding that homes are selling quite quickly. When you look at total inventory, builders now represent 33% of all of the homes that are available, where historically it was 10 to 15%. So the resulting impact is this outperformance on the new home side. And really throughout this year, what we've seen is that sales have far exceeded overall expectations. You're looking at here the average sales rate per month per community, sales adjusted for supply in select top markets across the country. 2019, your healthy year for comparison, 2021, the height of the market, and then current. When you look at 2021 versus today, it probably will surprise some of you that we actually have a higher average sales rate than we did in 21. The key thing to remember is you're actually comparing apples to oranges here, because as we were doing these presentations back in 21, we knew the majority of builders were intentionally capping sales. So it's not actually a perfect measure of comparison. My big takeaway is when you look at these markets, we have most that are not only slightly exceeding 2019 levels, but far exceeding where they were in that healthy period before we went through the pandemic and the accompanying housing boom. Now, as we look at this, we've seen this stronger than expected activity. We saw that the early parts of the year were great. We're seeing that the market is still doing well despite some seasonality. But I want to remind us that February through May are traditionally the strongest months for new home sales. And I want you to look at this graph, and I'm going to point out a few different time periods. This is showing you new home sales by month by year. And let's look at 2021. So that's the mint color. We talked about that really being the height of the market. You saw 2021 far exceeding what you would imagine during the spring selling season. You see that sales do come down June, July, August, but I think a lot of that has more to do with the capping of sales that we talked about. As you went through the end of 2021, we saw that sales were far outperforming what you would have imagined in the fourth quarter. Now let's look at 2022. So 2022 is that dark navy color. And again, you can see that outperformance in the spring selling season. And then interest rates went up and then confidence got hit. And we just saw this creep down, creep down, creep down, creep down in terms of overall sales. When you look at 2023, that's going to be your purple line. You can see this improvement throughout the year, hitting a pretty steady stride where instead of 2021 and 2022, you're really above all of these other years ahead of it. Starting to see a little bit of that seasonal slowdown for 2023, but not as dramatic as what we've seen across the board. And this matches up qualitatively with what we're hearing from builders. When we talked to builders about how the July felt to them, they said demand was on track with expectations. At least the majority of them did. The second highest response, though, is that demand is slower than expected. Throughout this year, our second highest response was demand is stronger than expected. But notice that it's slower than expected, but not worrisome. And that's really because we are seeing those signs of normal summer seasonality, plus a little bit of a hit related to the higher mortgage rates. But if you just read the headlines, I'm sure you see tourists are packing European hotspots, boosted by Americans. I'm case in point, just got back from 2 weeks in Europe and Africa. We know that those normal distractions that we lost over the past few years have fully come back. Last year, we were dealing with the affordability shock. Now we're really dealing with a more normal period of seasonality that you would imagine in prior years. So we're looking at all of this. And our key thing so far is that we understand that builders in the new home market is outperforming the existing home market, largely because builders can work with the buyers in terms of price and incentives, and because they represent a larger share of overall inventory. Now, what's happening is we're finding that 44% of builders as of July were still raising prices. Now, 51%, so the highest share, held prices flat, But if you're like me, seeing 44% of builders raising prices, despite interest rates going back up and how much we've seen home prices go up, it should make you a little bit uneasy, at least until you start asking yourself the question, well, how are they handling these price increases? And at least from my experience and what we've captured in our survey is that builders are being so much more cautious and so much more aware of what they're doing. If you think back to 2021, for example, we were seeing these price increases that were constant in very high dollar amounts, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Now, as we're looking at price increases, we're seeing a lot more tempered, $1,000, $3,000, $5,000. And really this focus from the building community of, hey, look what happened in the fourth quarter of last year. Prices got too high, interest rates got too high, we cut prices, consumers returned. Let's try not to get over our skis again. Especially when we look at the challenges, the top two challenges are related to current mortgage rates and to overall home prices. And it makes total sense. When you look at both the new and the existing home side, and you look at the level of home price appreciation we've had since the beginning of the pandemic, we're talking many markets that have seen 50, 60, or even 70% overall home price appreciation. And as you look at what that means on the ground, it means that entry level and the definition of entry level and the availability of entry level product is evolving. In the US, back before the pandemic, about 5 years ago, we had 60% of all of our homes that were under 400,000. Where we are today, it's about 40%. And as you look down the list, there's not one market that we've highlighted here that hasn't at least seen some of that more attainable product shift down. But look at the range. You have Lakeland in Florida, where almost 90% of the product is under 400,000. You have Sacramento in California that's down to none of their product that can hit that overall threshold. So we know and we understand that affordability is such a key and important part of how this market is evolving. So then you have to ask yourselves, okay, well, what are consumers doing about this? And then probably more importantly, what are builders doing about this? So let's start with the consumers. Consumers have options. They can stay put, either stay put in their current home that they own, stay put in a current home that they're renting. They can consider buying a home that is smaller than they originally planned. They consider buying a home that's in a different location than they originally thought, maybe not as nice of a quality. And you can have people that recouple, that say, you know what, it's just a little bit too expensive to be able to live in a home by myself for now. I'm going to move back in with friends or family or roommates. The key things, though, that we see consumers are doing about affordability is they're looking at smaller homes, they're stretching their budget, and they're looking at different loan options besides the 30-year fixed. Now, again, option 3 sounds scary on the surface. When you look at the share of loans that are adjustable, we are nowhere near where we were last cycle. Adjustable don't have to be bad or scary, but I know that that kind of brings memories back to last cycle. That's not what we're saying here. It's just consumers saying, okay, well, are there some adjustable rate mortgages that may make sense for me, at least in the near term, until, in theory, interest rates come back down. So consumers, they're willing to compromise. They're willing to put more of their funds towards housing if needed. But we know that builders are also adapting. We asked builders, are you changing your product to lower costs and sales price? Well, 25% of builders said yes, we're paring back our features. 37% of builders said no. They're basically saying, well, why would I? If you think about Toll Brothers, for example, or some of the builders that cater to a more luxury consumer. My consumer doesn't want less nice features or doesn't want a smaller home. If they're going to buy new, they want something nice. Makes sense. Some builders are staying firm. But we do have 38% of builders that are saying that they're building smaller homes. If any of you guys read the Wall Street Journal this morning, our data was highlighted about what's happening with the national average unit size. We're capturing a 10% drop compared to last year. Now, as you look at this data, I think the important thing here is when the pandemic hit, there was this focus of, oh, everyone wants larger homes and they're going to pay more for it, and they want a gym and they want an extra bedroom and they want an office. What we saw is for a short period of time, absolutely, those homes sold better. People were focused on how they can live at home in a bigger space. But now we're seeing this push and pull of what do people want, but also what are they able to pay for? And seeing that smaller home size is a fairly easy way to adjust for this. And I think the important thing is when you look at this, it's not that the homes are not livable. It's that sometimes the floor plans were easy to just do without putting in too much thought, and now we're seeing more right sizing, more efficient floor plans. And when you look where we're seeing this across the country, you're seeing some of the markets that have been the most affordable, that have also seen the most growth, that are striving to try to account for what they've seen with home prices. Places like Houston, Texas, Charlotte, Orlando, Florida, Minneapolis, Raleigh. These are some of the markets that lead the country for seeing the biggest drop in overall unit size. Okay, so builders can change overall square footage. What about product? What about density? Well, a key thing that we understand is that when I'm talking about attached, it doesn't guarantee a lower price, but oftentimes it can translate to a lower price when it's impacted with overall density and the kind of product that's available. When you look at the US, we've seen a 10% increase over the past 5 years of attached product that's being offered. And as you look down this list, you see some pretty dramatic changes in some markets where there's just this focus of, okay, what can we do? What kind of products can we bring? And this focus to say, maybe we lower overall size, maybe we also do a bit more attached product, have a little bit more variety for consumers to choose from. So we understand at this point, it's going to take work. It's going to take work from the building community. It's going to take work from the consumer side. But when we're focusing so much on consumers, we're focusing so much on affordability, and yet I said earlier, we're going to have about 5 million total sales this year. Why are buyers shopping today? Well, this is something that we pose to our builders to say, okay, you know, we've seen this outperformance. What do you think is driving the overall activity? Well, the number one and the key answer is lack of resale supply. We're dealing with this really tailwind that we haven't had that is just supporting overall growth. I don't think it will always be there. I don't think that will always be a huge factor for our market, but it's certainly something we're going to deal with probably at least for the next 12 months. But look at the other responses: relocating, having children, retiring, marriage, divorce. All of those fall into a category that we call life happens. So think about the market that we came from during the height of the market. We had all of those things we just talked about: marriage, divorce, all those different factors driving housing activity. But we also had people rushing in because of fear of missing out. We had investors buying homes, wanting to turn it into a rental. We had people wanting to flip homes. We had second home buyers. We had buyers that just wanted to move and they were compelled by the lower rates. Some of that extra level of demand has been flushed out of the system because of the higher rates. But what that leaves you with is what we're calling structural demand, or again, the life happens demand. We categorize this into 6 different groups of who is still buying today despite some of the challenges. Well, think about births. Think about the distribution of the largest living generation today, the millennials. They're really, the peak age is between 27 and about 32 years old. Women are having children at a record high age of 30 years old. So now you have more people, the largest living generation, hitting that point where they're having children. And yes, maybe they don't want to buy at today's interest rates, and maybe they don't want to reset a lower interest rate. But when push comes to shove, if they can make it work, we're seeing that's contributing to moves. Here's an example. I pulled this from a friend in high school. She was a friend back when I was in high school. And so she bought this home, an entry-level home with her partner. It was just the 2 of them when they bought. They ended up having 1 child in this house. And now they just posted that the house is up for sale because they have a growing family. Now this house no longer will work for 4 of them, where it definitely worked for 2 of them and kind of worked for 3. Doesn't make sense. I think logic would say, why is she selling her house? Why are they going to reset their interest rate? They shouldn't do that. But I think births and how they want their children to live, if they can make the money work, is more powerful than what we're seeing with rates. What about marriage? We already talked about the age distribution of the millennials right now. The average age for marriage, but about 27, 29, depending on if you're a man or a woman. Now, this is important too, because what we know is there's this increased propensity to own as you become married. When you look at first-time buyers, 50% of those that purchased were married couples. Now, it's not a guarantee that it's going to be a brand new household formation, but if you have 2 people that are renting and now they have the dual income and it's allowing them to convert to ownership, we know that this is one of the factors that, despite some of the affordability challenges, is allowing some people to get over that and continue to purchase. What about deaths? I don't like talking about this, but it is something that has an impact on the market, an estimated 3.3 million deaths in 2022. And as you think about this, a death doesn't immediately translate into a sale of a home, depending on who else did they live with, what does the family want to do with the property. But if you have someone that lived alone and then the home comes to the market, obviously it's increased supply without pooling from the overall supply pool otherwise. But we also know this plays into wealth transfer of some of the older generations passing it on to their children or their grandchildren, which also helps with overall affordability. So those are 3 of the 6 of the life happens. Another key group would be divorces. Nearly 700,000 divorces in 2021. And as we look at the divorce rate, we know that you're going from 2 people living together to 2 people living separately. Oftentimes, at least our research tells us that that converts to rental demand at first and then ultimately converts to more for sale supply or for sale demand in the longer term. But as you look at this group, we know that not every one of these categories also uses mortgages. And the key group, such an important group that we're seeing a lot of activity in right now, would be the baby boomers, or really the life stage catalyst of retirements. We know all baby boomers will be of retirement age by 2030. And I think the important thing about this cohort is that as we look at how the years have evolved, millennials were the #1 most active home shopper from 2014 up until 2021. In 2022, boomers overtook that group, the most active seller and the most active buyer. And I think this becomes important because it is partly because of retirement, but it's also because of increased mobility. Oftentimes, some of the boomers will not have a mortgage, and oftentimes they have equity built into their home or from longer term investments in the stock market that allows them to be a little bit more mobile than maybe you'd otherwise expect. And then finally, the 6th group that we're calling life happens is migration. What we know during the height of the market, or really the height of the pandemic, we saw work from home reach these new highs. We saw people moving. And I think even myself, I'm guilty of thinking, okay, well, we're going to see the movements slow down. We're going to see overall migration slow. And we don't have as much in terms of absolute levels, but there's still a lot of people that have had years to evaluate where and how they want to live. I'll use, again, just a personal example. My coworker that works with me and my parents are both moving right now out of state, one moving from Florida up to the Northeast, one moving from the Northeast down to the Southeast. We're just still seeing that, okay, well, now we have more flexibility. In my coworker's point, it's because of work from home, and my parents, it's because of retirement. But we're finding that as people move and continue to move, this has been such a big housing demand driver for some of the more traditionally affordable markets. Many of you have probably seen this before. It comes from the census data looking at where we have the most domestic positive net migration, more people moving in than moving out. Jacksonville leading the way, Tampa, Austin, San Antonio, Orlando, Raleigh. Now, as you look at this list, that's overall migration, but what we also like to do is look at the intersection between millennials, the largest living generation, and boomers, the 2nd largest living generation. And the reason we think this is important is we know from consumer research that about 25% of baby boomers plan to retire and move wherever their grandbabies are. That's what we call a baby chaser. So you want to move to be with your grandbabies. And so we've created this baby chaser index to capture where we have the most overlap between the migration of these 2 powerful forces in the overall economy and the housing market. Austin, Raleigh, Orlando, Charlotte, Dallas, these are the top 5 markets. Now, again, I like to use real life examples to layer in the data, and I was on a plane recently. Some of you know I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. I live in California now. This lady was born and raised in California, and she just recently moved to Ohio. Now, she lovingly told me she absolutely never wanted to or planned to move to Ohio, but as a boomer, her millennial child had moved there and had grandbabies. And so now she's moved off to Ohio to be close to them. And why I thought this story was important is, yes, this is an example of our baby chaser index, but more importantly, it highlights the idea of moving from a high cost area to a low cost area. This lady was in her 60s and had rented her entire life. And when she moved to Ohio, she was able to find that she could actually afford something. And so finally, for the first time, she was able to convert to become a homeowner. So we can understand that there are some buyers. I think that the math seems strange. How are people still buying? Well, the answer is if they can figure out how to make it work. People don't want to put their lives on hold. How long is the market going to be expensive? Is it ever going to see a correction? Is it going to just keep going up from here? I think for a lot of people, it's not a risk that they're willing to take when they're trying to get their kids into the school district that they want or have a backyard for their family or for their pets. So as we look at all of this though, and we talk about affordability, and this is great, we can identify some of the key buyers that are purchasing, but it also leaves a lot of buyers that are on the sidelines, a lot of buyers who have not been able to purchase. And what we understand is that more building could help. More building could help with affordability, more building could help with mobility, and we're seeing the idea of building evolve in real time, really throughout this year so far. So what you're looking at here are the top 25 markets across the country for overall housing starts. We have them in the far right, we have the percentage change. And this is an annualized basis. And so it's looking at the most recent 4 quarters compared to the prior 4 quarters. And you can see that all of these markets are still down. The key thing, and I don't have it shown here, but the key thing is if you look at just the quarter over quarter change, first quarter to second quarter, positive in almost every single market. So yes, the annualized number is down, and that's really because we're dealing with the slower starts in the 4th quarter and the 1st quarter, but we've definitely seen that improvement throughout this year. You see that in the permit activity that we get from the Census Bureau. You can see that we have seen this uptick in overall permit activity, and it matches the builder enthusiasm that we're capturing from the National Association of Home Builders, looking at the builder overall confidence. But we can talk about this and we can see some of the improvements and some of the enthusiasm to start more homes, but we also know that there's still some pretty clear disruptions in the market. The fact that government services are an absolute big headache, and the fact that land is a really big headache. And we'll talk about those a little bit more, but you even heard from Jeff talking about labor and how that's a big headache as well. But when you look at government services, I think it's really kind of the same thing that we've been dealing with. Understaffing, slow processing times, issues with permits, issues with entitlements. It's just making the whole process take longer. It's frustrating and a bit costlier. But that's looking at the biggest disruption. When you talk to builders and you say, well, what's your biggest worry? Number 1, land prices. And number 1 really goes hand in hand with number 2, which is new home affordability. It makes sense. Depending on the market that you're operating in, we're finding that land represents between 20 and 50% of that final home price. And we saw last year there was a little bit of breathing room when it came to land prices, especially in certain locations. I know, at least talking to some of the smaller private builders, they were like, we finally have a chance to step into the market because the publics have pulled back. Well, that was very short-lived. If you look at this, it's from our builder survey. Look back to December, we had about 2% of builders that were full steam ahead on land acquisition. As of July, 44% of builders full steam ahead, 50% cautiously moving forward. And when you see this kind of enthusiasm about the land market, it's probably no surprise that when you look at land prices, actually the majority of builders are saying that land prices are primarily flat. But we're seeing this uptick throughout this year of builders that are saying land prices are primarily moving higher. And like we said, builders are saying this is their biggest concern. And when you read the comments, you can understand why. Land prices are skyrocketing. They're out of control. Every deal is multi-bid and underwriting is unjustified. Or the land market is overheating with publics winning on deals with aggressive underwriting assumptions. So there are challenges when it comes to what's happening on the land acquisition side, what's happening on land and lot availability. So this is looking at how we track lot availability across the country. Now on the left, it's the national number. On the right, it's vacant developed lots with the months of supply. The months of supply is just looking at starts. How quickly are these units absorbed? Now, what we've seen on the national and on the local basis is that vacant developed lots and the access to has improved compared to where we're coming from. But an extremely important thing to understand here is that even with that uptick, we are still in a significantly undersupplied market. And this data comes out every quarter. And we know that the market has still been absorbing these lots fairly quick. And so we think that this is either going to flatten out or start to turn down. So know that when you look at this data, it is completely dependent on the direction of starts. And we've already talked about how starts have evolved throughout this year. But it's not just lots. If we're talking this full steam ahead, this enthusiasm about land acquisition and having homes ready for as the market kind of comes out of this high interest rate environment, when it does, you also want to look at total upcoming lots. Lots that are in the road work, that are in the excavation, that are in the equipment on site phase. You can see the distribution by market in the table on the left. And I think my big takeaway when I look at this data is since the pandemic, we've seen this increase in development of lots, and you can track over on this table on the right. Look at first quarter 22, second quarter 22. These are pretty high levels. Going back to 2018, we had seen nothing similar. Well, because there's just been this, is the market good? Is the market bad? Okay, consumers are back. No, they're full back. There's just this kind of jaggedness in activity that's resulted in some stop-go development in upcoming lots as well. And so this is something that we're tracking to see, can we smooth out this line a little bit versus seeing some of the upticks and some of the pullbacks. Now, finally, as we go into the last section, I have about 8 more minutes to go through this. I think the key thing to understand is we've already talked about this. We've talked about how the data for housing starts and the data for permits have shown this uptick. And we've seen a very clear sentiment shift from builders as the year has progressed. At the end of last year, we had 25% of builders that thought they would start more homes this year compared to last year. Now we're up to almost 60% of builders that think they will start more homes. Now, there's a caveat to this. And the caveat is, yeah, we'll start more homes if financing allows. Now, let me step back and explain this. What you're looking at here is credit availability of acquisition, development, and construction loans. We have 2 different sources. We have the National Association of Home Builders, and we have the Federal Reserve Senior Loan Officer Opinion Survey, SLOOS. When you look at this, anything below 0 is telling you that there's tightening credit standards. Anything above is saying that it's easier to get access. And we've seen that throughout this year so far, we have seen overall credit availability tighten up. Now, the important thing to know is that we have little to no concern about credit availability for the public builders. We have little to no concern about credit availability for larger private builders. We do think, and we are hearing on the ground, that there is some financing that's tightening up when you're talking about some of the smaller privates. So maybe they do want to start more homes, but maybe it's a little bit harder to get there. But as we look at all of this data, we've talked about how, hey, we've seen this outperformance really defying expectations despite the fact that interest rates have gone up. We are seeing right now, we've been polling some of our builders, there is this reaction to higher interest rates. We're seeing consumers pull back a little bit, plus we're dealing with overall seasonality. But we came out a few, probably months ago now, saying that the US new home housing recession was over. Now, we said that because we saw prices were going back up. We saw that sales were going back up. We saw that housing starts were going back up. When you have all 3 of those indicators growing, to me, that's the opposite of receding. Receding is to grow less. And so the key question is, okay, is that it? Have we been through it? Do we have a tough, depending on the market that you're in, 3 to 9 months, and now the market is fully back in growth mode? I'm not ready to say that just yet, because there are some broader macro things that we're keeping our eyes on. We know the Federal Reserve raised rates the last time they met, and I suspect unless we see a very pronounced pullback in the economy, they may raise rates one more time this year. The Fed has raised rates at a nearly unprecedented rate, and Silicon Valley Bank is a good example of not knowing exactly how things will play out. So we're continuing to watch what happens with Fed policy. Consumers, if you've been reading any of the headlines, actually beyond the headlines, if you've been reading any of the articles, you know that consumers, who represent 70% of the overall economy, have been behaving a little bit differently. We've seen that consumers are, in a lot of cases, working through their savings, though many still have more savings than they had going into the pandemic. But importantly, consumers are putting a lot more money on credit cards and on auto loans, and we're starting to see some default rates on those tick up. Now, hear me out. When I say an increase in default rates, really what we're seeing is going from basically none to back to where we were pre-pandemic. It's just the rate of growth, how quickly we've seen that change, that is just worth keeping your eye on to see how that progresses. And then I think the very clear elephant in the room is what's happening with the office market. I don't think there's anyone on the planet that can tell you how this is going to play out, but it's clearly something that we're watching when it comes to lower overall occupancy levels and the need for some of these organizations to refinance their loans. Those are the key things that I'm watching as any kind of risk to a double dip new home housing recession. But we feel so incredibly confident about the medium term of the market that, okay, a little bit of volatility, we got to get through some of this interest rate shock again, we got to get through this seasonality. But we want to continue to focus on the demographics, on the people that have told us, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, the people that have told us that they want to move. But also, I think it's incumbent on us in the new home industry to try to solve some of the problems. Maybe your focus is entry level or first move up. Okay, well, if that's the case, how do we better align home prices to income? If we want to have a healthy and sustainable housing market, we got to get that back in line. And if that's not your bread and butter, if you're catering to something more luxury, how do you create something compelling enough for someone to want to move? Let's say interest rates go down to 5.5% and someone has locked in 4%. That's still going to be a big monthly payment change. Do they love the community? Do they love the location? Do they love the design? Do they love the neighborhood? What is it that would make someone want to get rid of their home and their current monthly payment to purchase a new? What we ultimately feel, and I think what we know, is that there's a lot of pent-up demand in the housing market that is not being served right now and probably cannot be served right now until interest rates come down. Think about what happened during the pandemic. A rush to buy. You need to buy a home, you need to lock in the rate. Oh my gosh, the frenzy, the fear of missing out, go through bidding wars, waive inspections. And what we found at Todd Tamilak, he's our building product and our remodeling expert, he's surveyed consumers. They're not happy. There are a lot of consumers that feel dissatisfied, that they felt like they had to rush their purchase, and now they're in a home that, okay, great, they own a home, but they haven't actually found a home that suits them. So that's Todd's survey, and that matches up with what the New York Federal Reserve data shows us. That starting last year and through this year, we have this extremely elevated number of people that want to move over the next 2 years, about a quarter of people. And they're finding that, okay, there's not that much good opportunity on the resale side, but we have this home that's this poor fit for what we want. And so we think over time, these people will translate into either people that move once interest rates come down a little bit, or choose to stay put and actually put that money in the home to remodel. The way that Todd describes it is that he believes that 2023 could be our lowest mobility year in history. But once we see the market stabilize, that's when he expects us to see this uptick in activity that could translate into more demand as we go further out as well. So with that, we actually have 10 minutes here to go through questions. So please feel free to submit questions in the chat box. But like I mentioned earlier, we also got some questions ahead of time that I want to go through here. And then if there's any for the BFS team, please also send, and I'll pass it their way. I think the first question, I kind of hinted to this earlier, and it really goes to the conclusion of the presentation as well, is some economists said that in the second quarter, we would see interest rates cool again coming to the fourth quarter, and yet interest rates are going back up. And so I think the key question is, well, what gives? I want to give the answer to why people would have said it. And I also think over the next 12 months, we will see interest rates go down. I'm not going to time it exactly, but I do think that we could see interest rates back in the 5s. But let me explain what's happening. When economists try to make a forecast, they're doing the best they can to say, okay, what's the best way to forecast this out? And oftentimes history can be your guide. We have two things in particular that are really pushing the rates where they are. The spread between the 10-year treasury and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage has really widened out, and that's widened out because of some dysfunction in the mortgage-backed security market. But we're also seeing that elevated inflation is still playing into the rates. The hope, and I think the analysis that probably most economists had done, is over time, 12 to 24 months, the Fed will start to cut rates and that spread will compress, and both of those point to lower rates. The challenge is we live in an international world right now, and two of our biggest buyers outside of the US of treasury bonds would be China and Japan, both of which have decided to pull back on purchasing bonds. When they do that, that pushes the bond rate up. When the bond rate goes up, that pushes mortgage rates up. So logic can bring you as far as it can, but then when international players start to behave differently, they can influence rates as well. So that's why we've seen rates go up recently. Again, Fed rate cuts and a spread compression between the 10 and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is why people believe it may go down, especially if inflation continues to go down. But it's an important question, and we're going to keep monitoring it. But we think over time it should come down, but completely depends on kind of the international overlay as well. Okay, another question we have is, with all of the innovation coming through the industry, 3D printing, smart tech, hybrid panels, what do we think is the next big disruptor in the industry? And I think that the video that BFS had shown at the beginning, I think it was their home configure platform that they're working on. I think that's one of the big changes that we're seeing, not even looking in the future, but something that's happening now. I don't know about you guys, but when I put on like VR goggles, I get very sick from them. But being able to just click a button and seeing those elevation changes, I think, and color changes is something that we've been talking about for a long time, but it feels like it's finally here. This feels like a very annoying plug, so I apologize for it. But at Zonda, we launched a website called Livable, and Livable is made to connect consumers with new homes. We basically believe that if someone is going to buy a new home on Zillow, they're not actually getting a great new home experience. They're not going to see the community, they're not going to see the amenities, they're not going to see as many of the renderings, they're not going to get an understanding of the floor plan. We're connecting consumers with the builders, with the developers, and trying to make the community look as aspirational as many of the new home communities are. So I think Livable is another thing. And then probably outside of our industry, but something that could ultimately impact us, is really the role of ChatGPT and how that could, what I've heard is some cities, I don't even want to say what cities because I'm not sure I can remember, but I've heard of some cities across the country that are saying, well, can we integrate some kind of technology, ChatGPT or otherwise, that can help make the back end part of permitting or entitling a little bit more efficient or a little bit quicker? I don't know how much that will be utilized, but I think that feels like when you talk about some of the most inefficient parts of our industry, it feels like the government service side, no offense to them, seems to be one of those that's lagging the most. So I think that that's something that could be another big innovation that could be coming. Okay, let's see. Oh, that's an easy one. I don't know if this is, someone said, when you talk about attached product, what are you referring to? So attached is a shared wall. So condo, townhome, anything with a shared wall. When I talk about attached is what we're talking about. Let's see, I'm gonna read through anything else. Is the work from home trend fading, holding steady, or increasing? Very good question. Interestingly, it does actually depend on where you are. For example, in parts of Texas, it seems like it's fading. In many other parts of the country, it seems like it's holding steady. So I think it will depend on what city you're in and also what the city officials are communicating to businesses, because some cities are saying, hey, we're used to having a certain level of occupancy and those people coming and spending money at shops, and we need to try to encourage people to come back into the office to support the broader economy. But I would say in general, holding steady. I think we're kind of at a point where most people know if they're going to be work from home or hybrid or fully remote. This is a good one for the BFS team. Can you touch on steel pricing forecast? Does the team have anything on that?
The cold rolled index have come off their April highs, and have bottomed out over their last couple months. Most of the analysts see it slightly increasing as we go forward. Things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which most might not know, but that's the infrastructure build across the United States with billions of dollars going in. That's going to increase the demand and supply of that. So right now, the short answer is steel has bottomed out, is what most people feel. And with the increasing demand, we can probably see it starting to head north a little bit.
Great. I see a few other really good questions. One is a question I get every 4 years, so I'm sure you guys can guess what that is, but how will the election play into the housing market? And this is something that we've researched extensively, really just because it comes up every time and there's always just so much curiosity around it. What we have found for elections related to housing demand is that when you go through a presidential election, we don't even see it for the midterms, but a presidential election, if you look at normal seasonality, so we talked about that earlier in the presentation, that November is going to be a lot cooler than March, makes sense. But if you look at Novembers over time, and then look at the Novembers in election years, you see a more pronounced drop the November of an election year. But you don't normally see a more pronounced drop in October, and you don't normally see a more pronounced drop in December. So it's very interesting where I think people are just like, hold on, wait, let's see how things go. And then once it's settled, once it's decided, like the results or not, people I think just get a little bit more comfortable with the market and kind of resume their normal plans. Another extremely important question, and I think Mike Farmer, just so you know, this is going to be the last question that I'll answer and I'll pass it to you. But really a question about, the question specifically about Airbnb. And I know that there's probably like 3 or 4 weeks ago, there's a guy on Twitter that tweeted out like, hey, everyone that owns Airbnbs is not making their money and they're going to offload their homes. That guy is notoriously a little bit more dramatic. So like, we're not putting as much weight on that. But what I would say is we are absolutely watching Airbnb owners, flippers, second home buyers, people that bought a home for a rental. There's a lot of these different categories that bought it, I think, with hopes of making a huge return, or took out maybe more leverage than they should have, or maybe that they could justify based on how the market has evolved. So we think when you talk about supply, and if you send me an email, I'll send you an article we wrote for Builder Online about this. We think there are probably 3 categories that could end up being a bump up or result in a bump up in supply, though we don't think it's some mass foreclosure crisis, but we do think that there might be some forced sellers over the next 12 months, I think maybe more so than some people are expecting. So Mike, I think that's all we got, so let me turn it to you.
Ali, right on time, and thank you so much for all the valuable information from all of our panelists this afternoon. We appreciate everybody's time and look forward to seeing you all in our next quarterly call. Thank you.